Hello there, thank you for clicking. Just by way of quick introduction, my name is Hugo Newman and I hold a PhD in political theory from University College Dublin in Ireland, and I'm the founder of the Critical Thinking Project. The following will be a response to Konstantin Kisin's recent original video essay on why he's off the fence about Israel's war. I'm aware that he has since posted a response to some of the responses to his video, so I recognise that it's possible he will have addressed some of the points I make below. In any event, because I was already quite far along in preparing this essay response to his original video, I thought it better to simply finish this out first, publish it, and then later, if I find that Kisin has already adequately addressed some or even all of my points, I can always make a follow-up video. To properly evaluate all of Kisin's main claims would unfortunately take us too far into the weeds of the history of the conflict. However, answering in good faith does require substantiating some of my more robust counterclaims with sufficient evidence. And so this video is going to end up being a bit longer than Kisin's original post. Regardless, I will try to be as concise as I can within these constraints. I'd like to believe that if Kisin were to listen to this, he would take it as a sign of respect that I'm taking the time to substantiate what I say as exhaustively as I can, and also take it as a sign of how seriously I believe he has erred in his judgment. Before I get into the meat of the essay, however, I want to dwell for a moment on a trend that I'm noticing amongst those who position themselves as heterodox thinkers in the current political climate. I hope Kisin wouldn't object to me characterising him as such, as a heterodox thinker. In the interests of full disclosure, I find myself in broad agreement with Kisin and many of his fellow travellers on a number of contemporary political and socio-cultural issues. I consider myself a classical liberal, someone who recognises the vital importance of Western values and institutions. I'm as close to a free speech absolutist as you're likely to find, within the confines set by private property rights. And so when it comes to people like Kisin, for example, or Sam Harris, I sympathise with many of their political concerns and priorities. That's why I find it so baffling that the likes of Kisin and indeed Sam Harris could go so badly off the rails when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict. Even a passing familiarity with the warts and all history of the conflict, particularly the history that has been uncovered by the new historians of Israel like Avi Shlaim at Oxford and Ilan Pappé at the University of Exeter, should reveal how so much of the Israeli state's conduct over the past 60 or so years vis-à-vis the Palestinians is fundamentally antithetical to basic Western values and classical liberal ideals. Values and ideals to which people like Kisin and Harris habitually profess steadfast adherence. While I prefer not to speculate on motives, it may be instructive to ask why people who are nominally classically liberal and profess a strong commitment to Western values like equal liberty, freedom of speech, equality before the law, etc., would so assuredly go to bat for Israel despite its repeated flouting of these very ideals. I have my suspicions. I suspect that one reason is because defence of Israel now dovetails so neatly with general antipathy to the woke outlook that has come to predominate in elite institutions across the Anglosphere over the last 15 or so years. People like Harris and Kisin are, rightly, critical of the reflexive woke idea that everything Western is bad, everything non-Western is good, and that the enemy of my enemy is always my friend. They also, rightly, scorn the low-resolution, simplistic idea that the world is divided into oppressors and oppressed, and that by default non-Western groups and ethnicities are automatically oppressed and worthy of our moral support. It's easy to see how scepticism of this worldview might spill over into scepticism about the narrative framing of the Israel-Palestine conflict, which holds Israel as the Western-backed colonial oppressor and the Palestinians as the colonised, non-Western oppressed. The problem as I see it, to deploy the old cliché, is that a broken clock will indeed be right twice a day. And so occasionally there are circumstances in which the reality does come close to fitting the woke cookie-cutter framing. That is, the dynamic of one Western or Western-aligned ethnic group systematically oppressing and subjugating a non-Western ethnic group over a long period of time. And it just so happens that in the case of the Israel-Palestine conflict, that is exactly the dynamic that has prevailed since Israel's founding and subsequent illegal occupation and annexation of the West Bank and Gaza, until 2005 in the latter case. We'll get more into this below, but the point I want to press here is that it's tempting, if one is already sceptical of the overly simplistic worldview that leads woke activists to cast every political dynamic as oppressor-oppressed, to extend that scepticism to any conflict which is claimed to fit that broad mould. This is a form of confirmation bias that I submit Kisin and others have succumbed to. Secondly, I imagine that a reason why siding with Israel holds more sway with Kisin and people like Sam Harris is because it also dovetails so neatly with their more general critique of Islamic fundamentalism, jihadism, and their social and political impacts, a critique which, again, I sympathise with. It strikes me that Kisin and Harris's rendering of the motivational and psychological backdrop of Palestinian animosity towards Israel, and more narrowly, Palestinian militant and terrorist attacks on Israel, is utterly implausible, naive and unnuanced. And it is so precisely because such a naive and unnuanced account again dovetails so neatly with this broader anti-Islamist project. It's convenient for the purposes of that project to paint a picture of Palestinian society as being rife with jihadism and Islamist extremism and primordial, irreducible Jew hatred. The idea then is that these motivations alone are sufficient to explain Palestinians' animosity towards Israel. Or if not sufficient, they are at least the most important motivational factors when it comes to understanding any Palestinian violence against Israel. Under that framing, then, Israel becomes a bulwark against regressive Islamism and a bastion of Western values, if one is to take Israeli propaganda at face value, in an otherwise hostile region. That's the only way I can make sense of the tendency of otherwise seemingly principled, classically liberal people to fervently defend Israel against its critics. But let's set the motivational question to one side for the moment and turn our attention to Kisin's main factual and moral claims.
The easiest way to understand a complicated problem is to find a comparable situation about which you already know what to think. For example, if we accept that October 7th was a terrorist attack, as I believe most people do, the obvious approach would be to compare it to other terrorist attacks in recent history. That, as it happens, is impossible, because on a proportionate basis, the Western world has never experienced an attack on this scale. If we take 9/11, the most impactful terrorist attack in living memory, which shook the world's dominant superpower to its very core, we see that 2,977 people were killed in a country of 285 million people. On October 7th, approximately 1,200 people were killed in a country of just 9 million people. Some keep calling October 7th Israel's 9/11. That isn't remotely true. If October 7th was Israel 9/11, on a per capita basis, only 100 people would have been killed. In other words, October 7th was at least 12 times as bad as 9/11. And that's before accounting for the fact that Hamas took hundreds of hostages, many of whom have been killed since. So the obvious question is, if thousands of armed Mexicans had penetrated the southern border of the United States, killed 36,000 Americans, and dragged off thousands of hostages, how would America have reacted? Would there still be a Mexico to speak of? Whatever your view of the history of this conflict, I believe the logic of this is impenetrable.
Let's start by addressing this comparison to 9/11. Kisin's per capita claim constitutes one of the premises of his argument, and I don't take issue with this premise in terms of numbers. The problem lies with the ethical implication he's trying to draw from it. Kisin seems to suggest that if the 9/11 attacks had been equivalent per capita to what happened in Israel on October 7th, we could expect the US to have responded even more forcefully than it in fact did, and even more forcefully than Israel has done since October 7th. While this might be true as a matter of fact, or rather as a matter of counterfactuals, it doesn't follow that such a response would have been justified. The US's response to 9/11, the protracted wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, has been widely criticised for being disproportionate, counterproductive, and ethically unjustified. So, even if we grant that a more extreme response might have happened had 9/11 been per capita equivalent to what happened on October 7th, it says precisely nothing about the justifiability of any such response. The argument that the greater the magnitude of the terror suffered, the more death and destruction we have a right to inflict in return, is neither morally nor politically valid. Kisin's argument here fails to establish why such a response would be justifiable, and the US's actions post 9/11 only serve as a cautionary tale of overreaction and long-term self-sabotage. So Kisin tries to add argumentative scaffolding here to this first analogy, the 9/11 analogy, by drafting in yet another, this time with his Mexico hypothetical. If terrorists from Mexico invaded the US and killed 36,000 civilians, how would we expect the US to react? Again, the inference he is hoping we will make on the basis of this analogy seems to be that because we can expect the US would invade Mexico without hesitation and presumably bring all its military might to bear in weeding out the terrorists, we should therefore accept that Israel would and even should respond with overwhelming force in Gaza to the October 7th attacks. If this isn't the argument that Kisin is implicitly making with these analogies, then I don't know what argument he is trying to make. But when you spell it out like this, it becomes immediately flimsy. And I suspect that's precisely the reason he posed it as a pair of rhetorical, counterfactual analogies. He wants us to do the heavy lifting of making the inference to Israel being justified in its response to October 7th, because I suspect he recognises that spelling it out would result in a non sequitur. Yes, we can psychologically understand why Israeli politicians and citizens might want to respond with nearly unreserved ferocity in Gaza, but that doesn't mean the response is justified. Let's take Kisin's own predilection for per capita framings and spell out the implication of his rhetorical questions. Let's say Mexican terrorists killed 36,000 US citizens, which would be the per capita equivalent of the October 7th Israeli civilian death toll. So we need a per capita equivalent death toll for the hypothetical response in Mexico. The latest estimates in Gaza are that at least 42,000 Gazans have been killed since Israel launched its military campaign, though this is likely a significant underestimate due to the fact that the killing is ongoing and many bodies have yet to be recovered from the vast rubble that Israel has created in Gaza. 42,000 is around 2% of the Gazan population prior to October 7th. Estimates of the civilian death toll in Gaza from independent sources come in at around 80%, that is 80% of 42,000. 2% of the Mexican population is around 2.6 million, and so in our Mexico hypothetical, that would mean just over 2 million innocent Mexican civilians are killed in the US response. Would the US, in response to some terrorists from Mexico crossing its border and killing 36,000 US citizens, be justified in then invading Mexico and killing over 2 million innocent Mexican civilians in pursuit of the terrorists? I submit, and I hope that any morally sane person would say unreservedly that no, the US would not be justified in killing 2 million innocent Mexicans, even after such a shocking attack on its own soil. Would the fact that such deaths were framed as just so much regrettable collateral damage from hunting down terrorists render the death toll morally acceptable to any impartial observer? Again, I submit that it would not, especially assuming that such deaths were a predictable consequence of the US liberally blasting Mexican cities into oblivion while on their terror hunt. But even beyond the failure of the argument on its own terms, the very analogies are ludicrous to begin with. The correct analogy would look something more like this. Let's suppose the US had occupied Mexico for around 40 years consecutively, and then after finally withdrawing its settlers in 2005, imposed an illegal and brutal economic blockade on Mexico since 2006. And thereafter periodically invaded Mexico in the intervening 15 or so years on the pretext of stopping Mexican terrorists' largely ineffectual rocket attacks into the US, killing hundreds of thousands of Mexican civilians during those invasions. And all of this was occurring in the lead-up to the eventual Mexican border crossing and terror attacks that killed 36,000 US civilians. Now Kisin might ask, well, so what? That doesn't justify the Mexican terrorists eventually killing 36,000 US citizens. And I agree, of course it doesn't. So why do I insist on adjusting the analogy to make it, well, more analogous? Because it's relevant to the question of how the US should respond after the Mexican terror attack in our hypothetical. I'll come back to this in more detail further on when I address another of Kisin's points, but for the moment suffice it to say that the just response from the US would be to end the brutal 15-year economic blockade and periodic invasions that kill large numbers of Mexican civilians, to remove the root motor of terrorism and so break the cycle of violence. Would that require remarkable morality and forbearance from the US after suffering such a horrific terror attack? Well, yes, it would. But I was under the impression that Israel was supposed to be a bastion of virtue and progress and forbearance. In his interview with Norman Finkelstein, Kisin kept pressing this point, asking what Israel should have done. As though someone's inability to say what Israel should have done, a question which I think any honest person would struggle to answer, justifies what Israel did do. But again, I submit that there are perfectly reasonable answers to that question that outline responses that are infinitely preferable to what Israel did do from both a moral and political point of view. And so for all these reasons, Kisin's rhetorical, per capita adjusted analogies fail to establish the conclusions he presumably hopes that we'll infer on his behalf. The implied arguments are complete non sequiturs.
The first argument, whose central premise is that Israel is illegitimate, seems to be at the core of every debate. It feels reasonable and logical to many people to contextualize Israel's response to October 7th in this way. After all, if Israel was created through illegitimate means, it puts the discussion on an entirely different footing, doesn't it?
So Kisin wants to address the common retort that history didn't start on October 7th, which he somehow construes as implying an attack on the legitimacy of the founding of the State of Israel. I'm not sure how he gets from history didn't start on October 7th to Israel's founding was illegitimate, but that looks awfully like a straw man to me. Of course, we don't need to question Israel's founding in order to justify the claim that we need to attend to the history of the conflict prior to October 7th if we are to adequately evaluate and understand both the October 7th atrocities and Israel's response to them. Even if we grant that Israel's creation was legitimate, it doesn't absolve the country of responsibility for its occupation and systemic abuses since then. For decades, Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza have lived under a brutal Israeli occupation and annexation. The brutality has been voluminously documented by multiple human rights organisations for decades, including Israeli human rights organisations. They have been routinely subjected to collective punishment in the form of house demolitions and economic blockades. They have been subjected to periodic bombing campaigns, resulting in civilian casualties orders of magnitude greater than the civilian casualties suffered by Israel, endured the expansion of illegal settlements in the occupied territories, and arbitrary detentions without trial. Again, all of this is voluminously documented. This is the underlying, long-standing motor of the conflict that Israel's apologists want to obfuscate and distract from with talk of jihad and primordial Jew hatred that allegedly corrupts the hearts and minds of Palestinian Arabs. This is just preposterous, threadbare propaganda. Am I saying there is no anti-Semitism among Palestinians? Of course not. There absolutely is. I suspect it's pretty endemic. But is it primordial? Is it irreducible? Does it admit of no further analysis or explanation? Of course not. Its psychological origins are perfectly understandable, even if ultimately unjustifiable. It's completely predictable that if you are subjugated and illegally occupied by a nation-state whose people proudly and consistently broadcast their own ethnicity as a badge of honour, that you would come to resent that ethnicity and conflate all people of that ethnicity with your oppressors. And it's unsurprising if those who maintain the occupation and annexation of the land in which you and your ancestors have lived consecutively for centuries justify their occupation and annexation in the name of their own ethnicity. It's unsurprising in that circumstance that you come to resent people with that ethnicity per se. Is it justified? No. From the outside looking in, it's easy for us to correctly say things like, not all Jews are Zionists who wish to establish a Jewish majority state on the entire territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. Not all Jews desire that there no longer be a significant Palestinian Arab population in the West Bank and Gaza. Not all Jews think that the displacement of over 700,000 Palestinian Arabs during the 1947-48 war was morally justified. It's easy for us from the outside to come to the correct conclusion that it isn't invalid to hate Jews simply in virtue of being Jewish, and that not all Jews see Palestinian Arabs as inherent enemies. But is it understandable that there would be widespread anti-Semitism after decades of dispossession, occupation, subjugation, disproportionate killing, collective punishment, all carried out explicitly in the name of the advancement of Israeli Jewish interests and statehood? Of course it is understandable. So how then do we go about reducing and ultimately eliminating that anti-Semitism? We eliminate the ultimate motor and cause of it, the decades of dispossession, illegal occupation, subjugation, collective punishment, disproportionate killing, economic blockades and so on. And we comply with international law and actually grant Palestinians what they are legally entitled to. Not part of what they're entitled to, not some watered down, bastardized version of what they're entitled to, but what they are fully entitled to under international law, and in the event that that is not practically feasible, to allow for some kind of compensation or settlement. Now, Kisin might suggest that Hamas, for example, is all about jihad and Jew hatred, and that they don't really care about the death and suffering and occupation and economic blockades visited upon their people. Because they're so indifferent to the sanctity of life, those things barely register as motivations for Hamas. Hamas are all about simply killing as many Jews and infidels as possible. Unfortunately for this cartoonish thesis, we have pretty compelling evidence that it is spectacularly wrong-headed, and that evidence comes straight from the terrorist horse's mouth, so to speak. We don't need to speculate on Hamas's motivations for October 7th. They have explicitly stated them in a document that they published expressly for the purpose of explaining their motivations. And guess what? Not once do they mention jihad, or Muhammad, or Allah, or anything of the sort. What did they spend page after page hammering on about as what fanned the flames of their resentment towards Israel? You guessed it. Illegal occupation, annexation, a 17-year economic blockade, periodic bombing campaigns, house demolitions, illegal settlement expansion, targeting of children and cripples. See, for example, the Human Rights Report on the Great March of Return 2018. Political prisoners held without trial, and on and on. In other words, perfectly predictable and mundane motivations. Founding members and leaders of Hamas have formally and informally stated, in no uncertain terms, that their issue is not with Jews per se, but with Zionism as a political movement. For example, Hamas founder Ahmed Yassin has said, quote, "We don't hate Jews and fight Jews because they are Jewish. They are a people of faith, and we are a people of faith, and we love all people of faith. The Jews lived with us all of our lives, and we never assaulted them, and they held high positions in government and ministries. But if they take my home and make me a refugee like 4 million Palestinians in exile, we don't hate the Jews. We only ask for them to give us our rights." End quote. Does that sound like primordial Jew hatred, or rather a mundane, understandable political and territorial grievance? The revised 2017 Hamas Charter again states explicitly, quote, "Hamas affirms that its conflict is with the Zionist project, not with the Jews because of their religion. Hamas does not wage a struggle against the Jews because they are Jewish, but wages a struggle against the Zionists who occupy Palestine." End quote. Am I defending Hamas? Absolutely not. They've committed appalling acts of terrorism. Do I assume they always tell the truth, or we must always take what they say at face value? Of course not. But of all the places where they would want to avoid ambiguity regarding their political goals, surely their formal charter is near the top of the list. In any case, the point is not about justifying their actions. Rather, it's about discerning the ultimate root cause motivations and grievances that motivate their actions. And here there is no ambiguity. The notion that all of this is ultimately rooted in religious zealotry and jihad and Jew hatred is a manifestly preposterous and cartoonish thesis, the main purpose of which is to legitimize Israel's ongoing illegal occupation and economic blockade.
After all, if Israel was created through illegitimate means, it puts the discussion on an entirely different footing, doesn't it? Well, actually, no, it doesn't. Again, let's think from first principles. If we believe every pro-Palestinian claim and accept that Israel was created through the forced placement of European Jews in a foreign land by Western powers, we must look for a comparable situation in which a country was created through some form of displacement of the native population. Most of you live in such a country. The United States, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada are all the products of invasion, colonization, and brutal conquest. If you go back far enough, so is almost every other country in the world. Like it or not, Israel exists. It's home to over 9 million people. The idea that they would, could, or should accept the destruction of what is now their country is absurd. The United States government would not tolerate missile strikes and terrorist rampages from Native American reservations. Neither would any government of any country under any circumstances. Peace in the Middle East will not be achieved by attempting to undo many decades of history.
Despite the fact that the retort that history didn't start on October 7th doesn't entail the claim that Israel's founding was illegitimate, Kisin decides to dwell on the origins anyway. He notes that other countries were also founded on conquest and displacement, so why single out Israel for special criticism, assuming that its founding was based on conquest and displacement? This line of argument is problematic for obvious reasons. Virtually all of those other countries he's presumably referring to were founded hundreds of years ago in a vastly different moral and legal context, when the admissibility of conquest and displacement by quote-unquote superior races was a kind of moral truism. Israel, by contrast, was established in 1947-48 in an era when a broad ethical and legal consensus was already well on its way to being formed in the West, a consensus that held that state building by war, displacement and ethnic cleansing was at the very least problematic, if not outright unacceptable. Moreover, even if we want to turn a blind eye to the potential illegality of some of what Israel forces did during its founding, the reason we may single out Israel in a way that we don't single out other nations is simple. It's because of the legacy of that founding. It has been the longest illegal military occupation in modern history. And so we can critique Israel's treatment of Palestinians without needing to revisit the question of its ultimate historical legitimacy as a state. Here Kisin pushes yet another analogy comparing Palestinians in Gaza to Native Americans, this time on reservations, suggesting that no country would tolerate missile strikes from an oppressed group, no matter the historical context. But once again, Kisin's analogy collapses under scrutiny. First, the demographics of the analogy are absurd. In the entire territory between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, there are roughly equal populations of Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs, about 7 million on each side. So roughly 50% of the population in that region is Arab. Currently, the Native American population in the US accounts for about 2.9% of the total. Native American reservations and Gaza are, demographically speaking, completely disanalogous. A more apt analogy for Gaza might be imagining the entire African American population in the US were confined to a region previously military occupied by the US government for 40 or so years consecutively, then held under economic blockade for 17 years, while being periodically subjected to military bombing campaigns and invasions by the US government anytime the African American population lashed out with futile missiles or even tried non-violent civil resistance. Again, see the Great March of Return 2018. In that situation, would a terror attack emerging from within the vast enclave of blockaded African Americans be entirely surprising? I think most people would accept it wouldn't be surprising at all. Would it therefore be justified? Of course not. How then, in such a scenario, should the US government respond to such a terror attack? Kisin might want to suggest it would likewise be unsurprising for the US government to invade and effectively reduce the enclave to rubble, if that's what it takes to weed out the terrorists. I might agree with him that it would be unsurprising, knowing the history of US government interventions and military campaigns, but would it be justified? Again, no. Again, although Kisin doesn't directly pose the question, I imagine these analogies are intended to imply the question: what should the US do in such a scenario? What's the appropriate response? How about ending the blockade and periodic invasions of the African Americans in the besieged enclave? How about listening to common sense suggestions from the likes of Jewish-Israeli historian and exile Ilan Pappé?
So you said that Israel's response is motivated by revenge, and you criticize Israel's response. How would you expect, or how should Israel have otherwise responded to October 7th?
Oh, first of all, because of the hostages situation, it should have delayed any military action. And I'm not talking about removing the Hamas fighters from Israel proper. That's understandable why they did this. But before going into Gaza, if at all going into Gaza, they had a huge problem of hostages. And if they really wanted to save the hostages, and what I'm saying is even clearer than it was then, probably 8 months ago, they had to do, first of all, a prisoner swap. They were holding already at that time thousands of Palestinian political prisoners. So the first thing they should have done was an exchange of prisoners, which they haven't done. And secondly, they should have taken sometimes to consider whether a military operation can really achieve the strategic aims that they have defined, namely destroying the Hamas. Hamas is not just a military organization or guerrilla organization or terrorist organization. Hamas is a social, cultural, national Palestinian movement. It's a way of thinking. It's a whole world of ideas that is deeply rooted in the Palestinian history, in the regional history, and so on. There's no way you can uproot militarily a part of a liberation movement that is already fighting you for the last 120 years. And maybe it was much better to think about using allies in the Arab world and changing the whole attitude toward the future of Palestine and Israel, instead of using all the military might in order to satisfy a sense of revenge, or believing once more that they have the power to impose their will on the Palestinians. And we can see it's not working. Yeah. It's definitely not working.
Yes, so I mean, in terms of October 7th, so you're saying they should have taken a minute first to do two things. First of all, to actually understand what their goals are before going to Gaza and saying something like kill Hamas, and what does that even mean? Which I think other people are also starting to say, even pro-Israel people are starting to say, what does that even mean? And number two, you're saying they should have done a prisoner swap straight away. But don't you think that if you would have said, okay, you've just come in, you've killed a lot of people, however many people it was, but it was a lot of people. Now we're just going to do a prisoner exchange. We're not going to retaliate in any way. Is that not going to allow it to happen again in the future?
Well, the only thing that will allow it to happen in the future is what's happening now. Surely every Palestinian who was arrested in this operation, anyone who lost their families, that fuels the motivation to continue the struggle against Israel. Nothing that Israel has done is going to prevent not only another Palestinian uprising, and I don't know exactly how it will take place, but it definitely will take place, it will not prevent probably other groups in the area, such as Hezbollah or even Arab neighbors, if they would undergo a change of regime, for continuing and considering the military option, because all the other options of ending the Israeli colonization occupation is not working. So what I'm saying is that the fact that there's always bloodshed, or there are cycles of bloodshed on both sides, are not going to be solved by another cycle of bloodshed. There is a point where you must rethink whether your policies and strategies, or your idea that the only way forward, and that's what Israeli leaders are selling to their society, that the only possible way of life is to fight, to struggle, to be involved in military confrontations, in cycles of bloodshed. When do you stop? You never stop in a good time. I actually would have hoped that what the 7th of October proved was that the sense that Israelis have that they have an invincible army was proven to be wrong. Now, if your army is not invincible, if it's unable to defend you, maybe you should think, what are the implications of this for the future? Other implication is that the army has now to show that it is invincible. Well, the 8 months have shown that it's not better equipped to fight than it was before the 7th of October. So that you have to think in a non-militarized way on the whole history and the whole situation in which you find yourself, as did some whites in the very last moment before it was too late, in the last days of apartheid South Africa. And this was a kind of thing that the white community in Zimbabwe has failed to see. And look what happened to them. The white settlers in Algeria failed to see. Those who were connected to the United States and South Vietnam failed to see. You pay a price for this if you don't look the reality in as it is, and you still build your hopes on military power, or you're motivated by a sense of revenge or supremacy, of superiority or inferiority complex. Usually they go together. This all has proven to be disastrous for both sides, both the Israelis and the Jews. But of course, I'm talking about something that the current Israeli leadership will not be able at all to develop. So, but you ask me what is my opinion, but let's be realistic. There is not one Israeli leader or any member of the Israeli leadership that is able to open his or her eyes and to see the reality as I described it here.
And who can end the killing? Well, theoretically Israel could, of course, but for the reason we just discussed, they can't, won't, and shouldn't. That leaves Hamas, who could have returned the hostages and surrendered the people who took them. What is more, they could hide their civilians in the vast network of tunnels they've built to reduce casualties. Instead, they refuse to build bomb shelters and do everything they can to maximize civilian casualties. That's not my opinion, it's something Hamas are themselves proud of. A senior spokesman for the group, Sami Abu Zuhri, gave an interview on Palestinian station Al-Aqsa TV the last time this conflict flared up. The policy of people confronting Israeli warplanes with their bare chests in order to protect their homes has proven effective against the occupation, he said. We in Hamas call upon our people to adopt this policy in order to protect Palestinian homes. So yes, the deaths of civilians are tragic, and in a modern world where you can fill your social media feed with gruesome footage, that tragedy can be broadcast straight into your home 24/7. But the responsibility for their deaths is entirely with Hamas, and the failure to put a stop to the killing is theirs and theirs alone.
One of the most insidious arguments used to justify Israel's actions in Gaza has been the claim that Hamas habitually uses civilians as human shields, and that this is the main reason we see civilian deaths in Gaza. The story goes that Israel, being the most moral army in the world, is doing all it can to minimise civilian harm, but that tragically, Hamas's human shielding makes civilian deaths all but inevitable. And if it were not for Hamas, Israel would be surgically going in and taking out only the terrorists. But this claim is not only revealed to be untrue on closer scrutiny, it's almost the exact opposite of the truth. Firstly, with regard to the more literal sense of human shielding, independent human rights organisations, including Amnesty International, have repeatedly found no evidence to support the idea that Hamas forces civilians to act as literal human shields during combat. Instead, what's often meant by human shields is that Hamas operates from within civilian areas or uses civilian infrastructure to conceal its activities. Seeing as independent human rights organisations have not yet issued official reports on the current conflict, it would be premature to conclude one way or another whether, and if so to what extent, Hamas has engaged in human shielding since October 7th. However, we do have ample evidence from previous conflicts. Let's take a look, for instance, at Operation Cast Lead in 2008-2009, one of Israel's many deadly assaults on Gaza prior to October 7th. In the lead-up to the invasion, Israel broke the ceasefire with Hamas on 4th of November 2008, while the world's media were distracted by the US presidential election and Obama's victory, in what is dubiously claimed was a preemptive strike on Gaza. Thereafter, it killed some 1,400 Gazans, of whom 80% were civilians and 350 were children, and left 100,000 Gazans without homes. In the same time period, a total of 10 Israeli combatants were killed and 3 Israeli civilians. In its official report on the conflict, Amnesty International noted that there was, quote, no evidence that rockets were launched by Hamas from residential houses or buildings while civilians were in those buildings. Quote, Palestinian militants often used empty houses but did not forcibly take over inhabited houses, end quote. Hamas did, quote, mix with the civilian population, although this would be difficult to avoid in the small and overcrowded Gaza Strip, end quote. Quote, Palestinian fighters, like Israeli soldiers, engaged in armed confrontations around residential homes where civilians were present, endangering them. The locations of these confrontations were mostly determined by Israeli forces, who entered Gaza with tanks and armoured personnel carriers and took positions deep inside residential neighbourhoods, end quote. Amnesty International concluded on the theme of human shields, quote, contrary to repeated allegations by Israeli officials of the use of human shields, Amnesty International found no evidence that Hamas or other Palestinian fighters directed the movement of civilians to shield military objectives from attacks. It found no evidence that Hamas or other armed groups forced residents to stay in or around buildings used by fighters, nor that fighters prevented residents from leaving buildings or areas which had been commandeered by militants, end quote. Again, I want to be clear here, this is not an attempt to whitewash Hamas or represent it as some noble and innocent resistance group. Hamas is itself a thuggish outfit that treats many of its own civilians horrifically, as evidenced by this statement from the same Amnesty International report. Quote, Amnesty International delegates interviewed many Palestinians who complained about Hamas's conduct, and especially about Hamas's repression and attacks against their opponents, including killings, torture and arbitrary detentions, but did not receive any accounts of Hamas fighters having used them as human shields, end quote. On the other hand, there was evidence found of Israeli forces engaging in the more literal and barbaric form of human shielding themselves during Operation Cast Lead. UN investigators in 2009 reported, quote, hundreds of instances of IDF forces engaging in some form of human shielding. Perhaps the most shocking example being that of the, quote, Israeli army using an 11-year-old boy as a human shield during its recent Gaza offensive. Their report says troops ordered the boy to walk in front of them for several hours under fire, entering buildings and opening suspect packages, end quote. The above pattern of conclusions appears again and again across the final reports of several independent human rights organisations on Israel's other military incursions into Gaza in the subsequent years, most notably Operation Pillar of Defence in 2012 and Operation Protective Edge in 2014. Little to no evidence of human shielding by Hamas is found. Plenty of evidence of, at the very least, IDF indifference to the safety and well-being of Gazan civilians is found. The argument that Hamas has been entirely responsible for civilian deaths doesn't stand up to historical scrutiny. Israel's conduct, including its choice of tactics and weapons, plays a significant role in the high casualty count.
Which brings us to the final argument. Israel's attacks are indiscriminate and designed to inflict civilian casualties. This is actually the simplest argument of the four to address because it is an empirical matter. The war in Gaza is not the first conflict in human history. We can compare the ratio of combatant to civilian deaths in this war to others. What happens when we do? Historically, urban warfare operations result in a casualty ratio of 9 civilians for every 1 enemy fighter killed. In Gaza, it is 2 to 1. In other words, despite the deliberate attempts by Hamas to increase the number of civilian casualties, Israel has been extraordinarily successful in reducing them. This doesn't mean that there won't be incidents in which innocent Palestinians are killed, and, as in any war, there will likely be war crimes committed by both sides. But overall, the numbers don't lie.
Let's look more closely at Kisin's claim here that Israel's civilian to combatant death ratio in fact compares favourably with the average from other cases of urban warfare. This likely derives from John Spencer, Chair of Urban Warfare Studies at the Modern War Institute. Spencer has been making several public appearances in recent months defending Israel's prosecution of this war. Unfortunately, Spencer's claims are highly dubious and have been exposed by other scholars. Professor Mike Spagat, an American-British economist and researcher of war and armed conflict, serves on the advisory panel of Action on Armed Violence, AOAV. I'm going to quote Spagat at length from a recent publication of his at AOAV because I think it's imperative that we get clarity on this ratio claim, as Kisin rests much of his case on his ratio and per capita claims. Benjamin Netanyahu last month claimed before the US Congress that the Israel Defense Forces are in effect winning an urban warfare Olympics. Quote, "Despite all the lies you've heard," the Israeli Prime Minister said, "the war in Gaza has one of the lowest ratios of competence to non-combatant casualties in the history of urban warfare." Netanyahu appeared to be echoing claims of John Spencer, Chair of Urban Warfare Studies at the Modern War Institute, a man who frequently portrays the IDF performance in Gaza as reaching historic heights of cleanliness. As Netanyahu said, quote, "Israel," Spencer said, "has implemented more precautions to prevent civilian harm than any military in history and beyond what international law requires." End quote. At least 2 good articles have rebutted Spencer's claims about IDF precautions, so there is no need to add to that pile on here. What is of merit, instead, is to expose the weakness of Spencer's quantitative claim of a historically low non-combatant to combatant casualty ratio for the IDF in Gaza. A dangerous canard. Spencer regularly spreads the lie that civilians suffer 80 to 90% of the casualties in modern conflict. AOAV has shown that civilians constitute roughly 90% of all casualties when explosive weapons are used in densely populated areas, that is, when specific weapons are used in a specific environment. This is very different from saying that civilians are 90% of the victims regardless of weapons and environment. The 80 to 90% of all casualties being civilians is then a well-known myth, for which we even have an origin story, which Adam Roberts laid out clearly in an article that contains this prescient remark. The proposition, Roberts wrote, intended to alert the world to the importance of protecting civilians, has probably had the unintended effect of reinforcing cynicism about efforts to limit the human costs of war. Spencer and Netanyahu deploy the 80 to 90% canard in precisely this cynical fashion. They say that modern militaries typically kill far more civilians than combatants, so we should congratulate the IDF for not sinking all the way down to this abysmal level. In fact, continues the argument, urban environments are worse than non-urban ones, so even a 9-to-1 civilian to combatant ratio in Gaza's urban environment might be viewed favourably, although it would not rise to the lofty standards of the IDF. What is the reality of civilian to combatant ratios in modern wars generally and in urban wars in particular? Fortunately, we have a massive data set that is well suited to address this question, although it does have its limitations. The Cities and Armed Conflict Events, CACE, of the Uppsala Conflict Data Programme, UCDP, provides death counts disaggregated into civilians, unknowns and combatants for all conflicts in the world between 1989 and 2017. Crucially, CACE has a variety of markers that specify whether its events occurred within urban environments. The primary limitation of this dataset is that many deaths fall inevitably into the category of unknown. The truth about civilian to combatant ratios. The bottom row of the table above shows that civilians comprise about half of the deaths in modern wars if we exclude the unknowns. If a high percentage of the 20.7% of deaths classified as unknown are civilians, then the percentage of civilians would rise to perhaps 55%. But 80% is out of the question. The top 4 rows of the table give the analogous figures for 4 variations on urban warfare that are described in detail in the CACE codebook, but are largely self-explanatory. The most obvious point to take home from these 4 rows is that it is much harder to distinguish civilians from combatants in urban environments than it is to do so in non-urban ones. This ambiguity complicates the following discussion. If we assume that 3/4 of the unknowns are civilians, then civilians would account for roughly 60 to 70% of deaths in urban warfare. If, on the other hand, only a quarter of the unknowns are civilians, then civilians would constitute roughly 40% to 55% of the deaths. Thus, the evidence leans gently toward higher civilian percentages for urban warfare than for warfare in general, but a figure of 80% for civilians seems highly implausible. The Gaza War. The Gaza Ministry of Health has just released the fifth in a series of detailed lists of people it says have been killed in Gaza, covering deaths occurring between October 7th and June 30th. 41.2% of the deaths listed in the latest MOH list were males between the ages of 15 and 69. Few victims outside this demographic could be combatants. We must guess at the fraction of combatants among the 41.2%, but the age range of 15 to 69 is wide, so I think that a generous estimate for the IDF would be that half of the 41.2% were civilians. If so, then roughly 80% of all recorded deaths would be civilians. Of course, lower and higher percentages are possible. Conclusions. So what can we take from this? First, the percentage of civilians among the dead in the Gaza war is well above the average for modern warfare in general. Second, it is at least possible that the percentage of civilians among all those killed in the Gaza war is about average for urban warfare, but the evidence suggests that this percentage is probably a bit higher than average. Third, we can categorically reject the strong Netanyahu-Spencer claim that, for urban combat, the IDF is achieving historically low ratios of non-combatants to combatants killed. Now, Kisin might say, well, so be it. At worst, Israel is above average, but it's not like it's some monstrous outlier. There are two problems with even this response. Firstly, it can still be the case that the average is itself monstrous. If in urban warfare on average one civilian is killed for every one combatant, it's morally coherent to find that unacceptable. Secondly, we have ample evidence that the IDF is indeed showing flagrant disregard for civilian life in Gaza beyond the norm. It's hard to know where to even begin, so numerous are the examples. We could, for instance, start with the many documented statements from the highest political offices all the way down through army generals to IDF soldiers in Israel, which manifest at best clear disregard for the well-being of Gazan civilians and at worst explicit intent to cause as much suffering and terror among Gazan civilians as possible. Here's just a sampling. Israeli Minister of Defense. On October 9, 2023, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, in an Israeli Army situation update, advised that Israel was, quote, imposing a complete siege on Gaza, no electricity, no food, no water, no fuel. Everything is closed. We are fighting human animals and we are acting accordingly, end quote. He also informed troops on the Gaza border that he had, quote, released all the restraints, end quote, stating in terms that, quote, Gaza won't return to what it was before. We will eliminate everything. If it doesn't take one day, it will take a week. It will take weeks or even months. We will reach all places, end quote. He further announced that Israel was moving to, quote, a full-scale response, end quote, and that he had, quote, removed every restriction, end quote, on Israeli forces. Israeli Minister of Energy and Infrastructure. Tweeting on 13th of October 2023, Israel Katz stated, quote, all the civilian population in Gaza is ordered to leave immediately. We will win. They will not receive a drop of water or a single battery until they leave the world, end quote. On 12th of October 2023, he tweeted, quote, humanitarian aid to Gaza. No electrical switch will be turned on, no water hydrant will be opened, and no fuel truck will enter until the Israeli abductees are returned home. Humanitarianism for humanitarianism, and no one will preach us morality, end quote. Israeli Minister of Heritage. On 1st November 2023, Amichai Eliyahu posted on Facebook, quote, the north of the Gaza Strip, more beautiful than ever. Everything is blown up and flattened. Simply a pleasure for the eyes. We must talk about the day after. In my mind, we will hand over lots to all those who fought for Gaza over the years and to those evicted from Gush Katif, a former Israeli settlement. He later argued against humanitarian aid as, quote, we wouldn't hand the Nazis humanitarian aid, end quote. And, quote, there is no such thing as uninvolved civilians in Gaza, end quote. He also posited a nuclear attack on the Gaza Strip. Deputy Speaker of the Knesset and member of the Foreign Affairs and Security Committee on 7th of October 2023, Nissim Vaturi tweeted that, quote, now we have all one common goal, erasing the Gaza Strip from the face of the earth. Those who are unable will be replaced, end quote. Israeli Army Reservist Major General, former head of the Israeli National Security Council and advisor to the Defense Minister, in a Times radio interview on 12th of October 2023, he reiterated that the army should, quote, create such a huge pressure on Gaza that Gaza will become an area where people cannot live. People cannot live until Hamas is destroyed, which means that Israel not only stops supplying energy, diesel, water, food, as we did in the last 20 years, but we should prevent any possible assistance by others, and to create in Gaza such a terrible, unbearable situation that can last weeks and months." End quote. Giora Island has repeatedly been given a media platform to call for Gaza to be made uninhabitable, declaring, quote, "The State of Israel has no choice but to make Gaza a place that is temporarily or permanently impossible to live in." End quote. In an interview on 6th of November 2023, he suggested that, quote, "If there is an intention for a military action at Shifa Hospital, which I think is inescapable, I hope that the head of the CIA got an explanation of why this is necessary, and why the US must ultimately back even an operation like this, even if there are thousands of bodies of civilians in the streets afterward." End quote. I've literally dozens of other statements like this, some even worse, from soldiers, journalists, Israeli activists, etc. Such attitudes aren't outliers. They're representative of Jewish sentiments in Israeli society. But not only do we have words, we have actions. Again, dozens of well-documented examples of Israel directing Gazan civilians to go to alleged safe zones and then bombing those same safe zones shortly thereafter. Again, deploying the repeatedly disproven propaganda line that the reason they bombed those refugee camps or safe zones or hospitals was because Hamas was hiding out there and using them as human shields. Here again is a sampling from an ideologically broad spectrum of news outlets. As Israel warned Gazan civilians to evacuate, IDF bombs struck city described as sanctuary. ABC News. Israel told Palestinians to evacuate to southern Gaza and stepped up attacks there. NPR. West Bank strike. Israel accused of targeting civilians in deadly attack. BBC. Military experts discuss Israel's use of unguided bombs and harm to civilians in Gaza. PBS. To dwell for a second on this latter piece, I highly recommend Kisin and others read it. In this interview, Mark Garlasco, who was the chief of high-value targeting at the US Defense Intelligence Agency from 1997 to 2003, expresses his shock at the fact that 40 to 45% of the bombs that Israel is dropping on Gaza have been unguided or so-called dumb bombs, when it has a vast arsenal of US-provided precision-guided munitions that it could be using instead. Garlasco states, quote, "In 2002 and 2003, we, the US, had 65% of all bombs being precision-guided for Afghanistan and Iraq. And by Libya in 2011, it was 100%. But really, it's not just the use of unguided munitions that's leading to so many civilian deaths in Gaza. It's the choices that Israel's making of not applying civilian harm mitigation, of not using smaller weapons with less blast and fragmentation, like the GBU-39 that they could be using. And this is why we're seeing upwards of 20,000 dead Palestinians right now. We're talking here about 10,000 to 15,000 unguided bombs being dropped in one of the most densely populated parts of the earth. And this is incredibly dangerous. Now, looking at the weapons transfers that are put publicly out by the Defence Security Cooperation Agency, we can see that over 35,000 guided weapons have been provided to Israel in recent years. And that doesn't include the weapons that were provided just this year, and that right now is classified. But let's take again a look at US practice. When I was in the Pentagon and conducting targeting there for the Iraq War, for example, in 2003, we were dropping munitions in Baghdad and throughout different cities in Iraq. And at no time did I ever hear a weaponeer suggest to me that we should use an unguided munition. Since Kisin likes to talk about ratios and numbers, let's consider another dimension of the Israel-Gaza conflict more broadly. Looking at the data on civilian casualties over the past 2 decades to get a clearer picture of the proportionality, or rather the lack of proportionality, during Operation Cast Lead in 2008-2009, 1,181 civilians were killed in Gaza, while 10 Israeli soldiers and 3 Israeli civilians were killed in Israel. During Operation Pillar of Defence in 2012, 103 civilians and 55 combatants were killed in Gaza, while 4 Israeli civilians and 2 soldiers were killed. During Operation Protective Edge in 2014, 2,251 people were killed in Gaza, 65% of whom were civilians. In Israel, 67 soldiers and 6 civilians were killed. In the current conflict, roughly 40,000 people have been killed in Gaza, 52% of whom we know are women and minors. On the Israeli side, 876 civilians and 756 soldiers have died. If we look at the total civilian casualty numbers over the last 20 years, excluding the current conflict, around 2,875 Gazan civilians have been killed, compared to 27 Israeli civilians. That's a ratio of about 106 Gazan civilians killed for every 1 Israeli civilian. Including the current conflict since October 7th, the ratio is probably around 36 Gazan civilians killed for every one Israeli civilian killed. All of this taken together makes it hard to sustain the idea that Israel is going to great lengths to minimise civilian harm in Gaza, and makes it far more likely that, at the very least, Israel is showing blatant disregard and callousness towards Gazan civilian life. It's no great mystery why Israel maintains its occupation in the West Bank and its economic blockade and periodic bombardments of Gaza. A large percentage of Israelis, and particularly Israeli politicians, have, since its founding, had designs on establishing a Jewish majority state in the entire landmass between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. And I can, to some extent at least, understand the historical and psychological impulses that have driven this vision. Jews' historic persecution has been frightening indeed, and so the collective desire of the diaspora for their own national safe haven makes psychological sense at least. This, fundamentally, is what modern Zionism is, a vision for a greater Israel in which there is a stable and significant Jewish majority in the entire region of historic Palestine. The dark and real implications of this are that Israel could not tolerate a large Arab minority within the whole swath of land. If Israel is to be established throughout that landmass, either the present demographic reality cannot prevail, or Palestinian Arabs in the entire landmass cannot have full political rights. Israel uses the tolerably small Arab minority within its legally recognised borders as a convenient propaganda pressure valve, so that any time anyone criticises its humane treatment of Arabs in the occupied territories or in Gaza, they can point to their own small internal Arab population and claim that it cannot be the case that they treat Palestinian Arabs appallingly, since their own internal Arab population enjoys full rights. Through its near unqualified diplomatic and military support from the US, Israel has established itself as the most powerful military in the region. As such, it is insulated from immediate and major downsides from sustaining and even expanding its de facto control of the occupied territories and incrementally establishing a new, and they hope irreversible, demographic reality in those areas, primarily through allowing illegal settlements. The disincentives to the Zionist project are virtually zero, since Israel faces no cost for depriving Arabs in the occupied territories of full political rights. They have, as a result, every incentive to hold on to the territories over which they gained de facto control during the wars of 48 and 67. Though under international law they were and continue to be required to relinquish the occupied territories back to the Palestinian people, why would they do this when the US can, on their behalf, veto every UN resolution brought against them, while supplying Israel with billions upon billions of dollars of unconditional military aid and weaponry? The reality that all Israeli Jews and Zionists recognise, even if they prefer not to admit it out loud, is that they could never tolerate a large Arab minority with full political rights within its borders proper, since this would, of course, make the vision of a Jewish majority state fundamentally unstable and hostage to slight demographic changes between Arabs and Jews. Zionism, as a philosophy of ethno-statehood, is a zero-sum game. A large Arab minority with full political rights cannot, by definition, coexist stably with a slight Jewish majority within a Jewish majority state. The day the scales of ethnic demographics tip in favour of the Palestinian Arab community is the day Israel as a de facto Jewish majority state ceases to exist, and thereafter its legal status as the nation-state of the Jewish people becomes permanently compromised. And so the Zionist project can only tolerate relatively small minorities of other religions and ethnicities within its borders proper. Israel's apologists keep trying to sweep these dark and inconvenient realities under the rug of propaganda, but the dusts periodically get thrown up during these conflagrations, and now the clouds of carnage are blindingly obvious.